Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
It's so nice to be here and to have a chance to speak to all of you. I have to confess that I was very surprised at the audience because I work on issues around motherhood, I work on egg freezing, solo motherhood, later motherhood, and probably about 99% of the time, the people I work with and the people I talk to are women in their late 20s, 30s, early 40s. So it's a really interesting and different experience for me to speak to a much more mixed audience, and I'll be really interested to hear some of your feedback on these questions. So I thought what I would do is, first of all, just introduce myself and the kind of work that I do, and maybe say a little bit about why I do it. And then I'll give you some statistics about how the nature of motherhood and how fertility is changing in the UK today, how 21st century fertility patterns are different to what they were a generation ago. I'll talk about some of the questions that are raised by these statistics. And then the really interesting thing is I'd like to give you some case studies of women who are making these sorts of new decisions that I look at in my work. So first of all, just to say what I do, I am a sociologist by training. I'm a sociologist of gender and of reproduction. What that means is that I spend my time thinking about the social and relational and ethical and familial reasons and issues that surround how we have families, how we create families, and how people might feel within those families. So that's really the thing I'm interested in. And I'm a qualitative sociologist, which means that I don't really work with large numbers and large data sets and statistics, but I work with people's stories. So what I'm really interested in are the individual stories behind kind of the headline numbers we see. For the past 15 years, my work has been predominantly in the area of high-tech reproduction. So I've worked with couples going through IVF to try to understand a bit better how that experience of going through IVF affects their couple relationship, or the way they might think about their bodies, or the way they might raise their children. I've worked with women who've donated eggs and women who've received donor eggs, looking at similar questions about how they feel about those things, how they feel about relatedness. A recent project that I finished a year ago was looking specifically at single women's fertility options. So I was based in a fertility clinic in London, and that's where a lot of this material is from that research project, looking at single women who were predominantly in their late 30s, who really didn't want to miss out on becoming mothers, but weren't quite sure how to make that happen for themselves. So in some cases, these women were opting to freeze their eggs, this new technology. In some cases, they were going for solo motherhood. And in some cases, they were doing things that were perhaps more inventive, like co-parenting with friends and things like that. So I was really trying to understand why these women were in the situation they were in, how they felt about the situations that they found themselves in, and how they thought about the options that were open to them. And my current research project that I've just started is looking at women who are having children after the age of 40, which is kind of a really fast-growing group, and you might have heard about that a little bit in newspaper headlines recently. So to look at some of these broad statistics about fertility changes. The average age of childbirth is increasing pretty much all over the world, and fertility rates are declining. So we are entering a period that many demographers refer to as late and low fertility. Men and women are having children later in life, and they're having fewer children than they used to. Now, this is not a pattern that's unique or specific to the UK. It's pretty much throughout Europe. It's true in Australia. It's even true in places like India and Pakistan, which we might find unusual. They started at higher levels, but also they are similarly seeing decline in fertility rates. In the UK, the current total fertility rate is 1.7 children per woman, and birth rates are at their lowest since records began. So we are having the fewest children we've ever had since records began. If we compare the crude birth rate for 2018, which is the last year that rates are available, there's almost a 50% drop since 1947. So in the span of about half a century, there's been a 50% drop in the birth rate. And in 2017, the average number of children in completed families was 1.89. And again, that's lowest since records began. So still 2 children is most common for completed families, but there are more women who are having no children and more women who are having just 1 child. So why are we seeing this kind of decline in fertility rates? Well, of course, there is a whole host of reasons, including improved access to contraception, reduction in child mortality, which might mean people have less children, lower levels of fertility as people start to have children later in life, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about, desire for smaller families, and what the media constantly refer to as this idea of postponed childbearing, so people wanting to have children later in life. So what are the kinds of patterns we're seeing, particularly with regards to postponed childbearing? So I did say this age of childbearing is getting later and later. If we look at cohort differences, we can see that there's been a massive shift in the average age of childbirth. So for women who were born in 1972, who reached the age of 45, when would that have been? Fairly recently. For that cohort of women, the average age of childbirth was 31. So that was the average age in which people had children. For their mother's generation, so those women who were born in 1945, the average age was 23 or 24. So in the space of around 1 generation, we went from being a society who had on average their children at around 23, 24, to being one in which women are having children on average age 31. That's an enormous difference within the span of a generation. Right now in the UK, women over 40 are actually the only age group for whom fertility rates are on the increase. So if we look at every other age group, women under 20, women between 20 and 30, their fertility rates are declining. Some of them are declining a lot faster than others. So women under 20, their fertility rates are declining very, very rapidly. Some of them are declining much more slowly, but women over 40 are the only age group whose fertility rates are actually on the increase, who are having more children than they used to. In fact, that increase is so profound that since 1990, it's almost tripled. So in the last 30 years, we've seen almost a tripling of the number of women who are having children after the age of 40. The last time in the UK that we had a big surge, big increase in women having children in their 40s was after the Second World War. But those women were of a very, very different demographic than the women who are having children in their 40s now. So those women tended to be women with large gaps in their families. So they were having larger families and they were having subsequent children, sometimes with large gaps between their early children and later children. Whereas a lot of women who are having children in their 40s now are first-time mothers or are having very short spacing between their children. And there are obviously other changes too, including assisted reproduction and IVF, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. Since 2016, quite interestingly, there are now more children born to women over 40 than there are to women under 20. So again, that's an enormous change that we've seen in the space of a generation. If we look at especially tabloid headlines, the UK has gone from being a society that had, quote unquote, a teenage pregnancy problem to a society that has, quote unquote, a geriatric pregnancy problem. So how has that happened? How have we, in the space of a generation, flipped from being one in which we had higher levels of teenage pregnancies to being a society where we actually have had drastic lowering of teenage pregnancies, which has been desired? Obviously, there have been programs to initiate that, but this increase with the over 40s. So why are women postponing childbearing? Now, the answer to that, I argue in my work, is not as clear-cut as it seems. So these kinds of statistics and large numbers that I've just sort of introduced to you, they come from broad-scale census data, or they come from places like the Office of National Statistics, where there are huge numbers and people crunch those numbers. The Office of National Statistics, who produces these numbers, says, in their report talking about why women postpone childbearing, they say that some of the reasons are greater participation in higher education, delaying marriage and/or partnership formation, extended educational and career commitments before starting a family, labour market and economic uncertainty and the greater threat of unemployment, which is a disincentive to have children, and what they call the rising opportunity costs of childbearing. So the things you have to give up, the more things you might have to give up when you have a child. Undoubtedly, those factors do all play a part. But what I find when I speak with women who are in their 40s and having children is not these reasons. They don't tell me that they're having a child in their 40s because of the housing market or because of the opportunity costs. In fact, a lot of the women I speak to who are having children in their 40s don't talk about it as a choice at all. So some of these women mentioned that they wanted to have children probably in their 30s. They thought maybe 33, 34. But there were circumstances that they feel are outside of their control, outside of the purview of their conscious choices, that actually affected the timing of their childbearing and pregnancies. So that's the kind of difference I'm really interested in trying to kind of articulate and tease apart. And that's really some of the things I'd like to sort of think about with you guys this evening. So we also know that there have been huge changes in marriage and partnership formation. And I just wanted to give you guys a couple of statistics to do with that, which I think is extremely relevant to the changes we're seeing in fertility patterns. For the last year that data is available for, 2018, 58.7% of conceptions actually occurred outside of a marriage. So almost 60% of conceptions occurred outside of a marriage, and almost 50% of all births were outside of marriages. So that discrepancy between those two figures is quite interesting because fewer of the conceptions that result outside of marriages actually end up in live births. So women are more likely to terminate their pregnancies when they're not in marriages, apparently, according to these statistics. But also, people might choose to get married in between conception and childbirth. But really, one of the things that's very interesting about this statistic, that almost half of all births happen outside of marriages, is that relationship patterns are changing. So again, huge differences between cohorts, between generations. I already mentioned to you that the age differential for the 1972 cohort, most common age of motherhood was 31. For the 1945 cohort, it was 23 to 24. For the 1972 cohort, the completed family size was the number I mentioned to you earlier, 1.89 children, so under 2 children. For the 1945 cohort, it was 2.19 children. So again, showing that we're having fewer children. Of those born in 1945, 60% had at least one child by the time they were 25. For those born in 1972, that number had already dropped to 33%. So a halving. Only half as many women after a generation were having their first child by the age of 25. And of women who are 25 now, that number has dropped once again to just under a quarter. So again, in just over a generation, we've gone from most women having their first child before the age of 25 to most women not having their first child until much later on. And interestingly, the Office of National Statistics thinks about a woman's reproductive years as 15 to 45. And of course, with the advent of assisted reproduction, that age bracket is actually wider, but they still measure 15 to 45. And interestingly, within that same cohort, we see an enormous difference in the number of women who don't have children by the end of their reproductive years. So the 1945 cohort, 10% of them, so 1 in 10, ended their reproductive years without any children. For the 1972 cohort, it was almost 20%. So again, a doubling in the number of women who don't have children. When I talk about that figure, sometimes people find it counterintuitive because they think, well, but now we have much better fertility treatments, so wouldn't we expect childlessness to be less? Well, it's not quite as simple as that, because actually we have far more people being affected by fertility problems now because we're trying to have children later in life than used to be the case a generation ago. And also, of course, child-free living is a much more acceptable option now. So those factors create those differences. So it's really interesting to think about what are some of the social differences between those two cohorts. So, of course, we know that women born in 1972 had significantly greater reproductive freedoms than those who came before them. They had much greater access to contraception. The pill really revolutionized women's lives. But they also had much better access to safe abortions. They had much better access to maternal and fetal and perinatal care. And they were the very first generation to grow up knowing that they would have access to fertility treatments and assisted reproduction. We've also talked about the changing nature of relationships, lower rates of marriage, higher rates of cohabiting, more relationship dissolution and divorce with that later cohort. And huge changes in dating patterns. When I interview the women I talk to for my various studies, that's one of the main things that women talk to me about, the enormous changes that are happening in the world of dating, how difficult it is to find someone, how there is a culture that really encourages this sort of slightly disposable attitude towards other humans, how there is this idea that there's plenty more fish in the sea. And what's really interesting is how those changing dating patterns affect different genders differently. So I can talk a little bit more about that because that's really something a lot of these women speak to me about. Of course, there's been women's increased participation in education and the labour market, including career advancement and economic freedom. But one side effect of that, which we don't really talk about, is something that demographers refer to as hypergamy. So as a society, we are still more or less used to the default idea that women, quote unquote, marry up. So they tend to marry men who maybe earn just a little bit more than they do, or they tend to marry men who are a little bit more qualified than they do. But as we have more and more women being exceptionally qualified, it's becoming harder for them to find those men who are a little bit up on whatever ladder we might be looking at. And it's harder to achieve the kind of the classic milestones of adulthood. So things like buying a house, things like being settled and stable in your profession. So there are more life choices available both to women and men, including child-free living, same-sex partnerships, singledom. Those are all valid and increasingly popular life choices. But there are also increasing dilemmas that affect particularly certain groups of women. And so these are the women I tend to work with who are, in general, educated, professional, very successful. And in fact, they are overachievers in almost all aspects of their lives. And yet they have not really achieved what they desired with regards to reproduction and relationships. So there's that sort of disjuncture in how they're experiencing their lives. Now, what's interesting about those women's experiences is that a lot of them feel responsible for the way their lives have turned out. So I'm thinking here about women who are in their late 30s who don't have children, who expected to have had children by that point. And a lot of them will say to me, well, you know, all my friends are married, they've all just had their second kids, you know, half of them have moved out of London, and I'm from London, so half of them have moved out of London and, you know, got their big houses in the suburbs, and, you know, I'm just still meeting these terrible guys online, and I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And because I have the privilege of hearing so many of these women's stories, I feel that I can so clearly say to them that they haven't done anything wrong. And really, the choice, the way that their lives have turned out, yes, of course, it's partly to do with the choices they've made in their lives, but it's also partly to do with these much, much broader social changes that are taking place, social and demographic changes. So even though a lot of these women who are in their late 30s and who are childless feel like they're the only one, I feel like my research, the kind of qualitative social science research, shows that actually they're part of a demographic transition, they're part of a societal trend, and they might not know that many other women who are in that situation, but they are really part of a growing group, and it's really important to try and understand why that's the case. So second wave feminism had this motto, I assume most of you have heard of it, that the personal is political. So for those second wave feminists, that motto was a way to say that our personal experiences have a political importance, have a political impact. And I think it's really important that we also realize that the political is personal. So what is happening in terms of broader macro-sociological and political events influences how our personal lives turn out and influences the kinds of choices that are available to us in our personal lives. So I thought, what better way to illustrate that than to actually give you some real life stories of some of the women that I have spoken with. So I haven't mentioned this, but I guess the background to this is that as women get older, their fertility declines. That is an unalterable and unfair biological fact. So a woman is born with every single egg cell she will ever have, and she loses those at the rate of about 1,000 a month before she even starts puberty. So by the time a woman is in her mid-30s, that decline in her fertility has sped up quite significantly. And it's not something that we can do a huge amount about. And it's one of the greatest gender inequalities that men and women have, biologically speaking. Men can regenerate sperm, and they can produce, thousands of sperm every day, whereas women only ovulate the one egg and they lose their eggs. So even though, as a woman who's in her early 30s, somebody might feel extremely young and extremely fit, and they may very well be, that doesn't change the fact that reproductively, biologically, their body is starting to get sort of into the eve of its reproductive life cycle. So one of the technological fixes that's been brought about to try and create a kind of a solution to this is the technology of egg freezing, which I assume you've all sort of come across more or less, in the news or whatever. So egg freezing technology is a way to take a woman's eggs, cryopreserve them in liquid nitrogen so that essentially they are frozen in time. If a woman were to freeze her eggs when she's, say, 33, the idea is that at a future point, maybe when she's 40 or 42, she could come back, have those eggs thawed, and have the opportunity to try to conceive with her 33-year-old eggs, as opposed to with her much more degenerated 42-year-old eggs. Now, egg freezing used to be quite a difficult procedure. Sperm cells are very small and they don't really have much water content. So they responded very well to freezing, and sperm freezing has been around for decades, and it's been very successful. And you can actually go online, if you choose to do so, to a sperm bank in Denmark and have a frozen sample shipped to your house with DHL. So technologically, freezing sperm has been very easy. Freezing eggs was much more difficult because egg cells are the largest cell in the human body, and they have a very, very high water content. So they didn't respond very well to cooling and then warming again. They tended to form sort of basically what we can think of as shards, or kind of like little glass shards that would damage the integrity of the egg. And it wasn't really until the 2000s that a new technology called vitrification was developed, a way of flash freezing that would actually mean there was much greater success of being able to freeze and thaw eggs. In 2012, the big bodies that govern assisted reproduction, the American Society and the European Society, said, okay, we now have a fair amount of data to say, egg freezing is no longer experimental, we can start using it. And really it was predominantly used in the case of women whose fertility was going to be damaged because they were undergoing some kind of medical treatment, like cancer treatment. So the idea was, let's freeze some of their eggs so that they might be able to use those later on. And in 2012, when these big bodies said, okay, egg freezing is no longer experimental, they actually warned. They said, we're saying this is no longer experimental, but there are no guarantees. We don't really know. We don't have enough data. So we need to be cautious about women using this as a way to think about being fertile long into the future. But of course, that wasn't really how things panned out. So companies started offering egg freezing to women for what they called quote unquote social reasons. And that was a bit of a double-edged sword. because it gave some women a technology that could be helpful, but actually it wasn't really able to give them enough information about what their success rates might be, what their chances might be. And of course it was, and it still is, an extremely expensive procedure, which meant that it was only available to very small numbers of women in the first place. So I want to talk about how some of the women I came across as part of my single women study found their experiences with egg freezing and why they decided to do this. So the first one I will tell you about is a woman called Eliza that I met. Eliza was 34 when we met, and I had 3 interviews with her over the course of a year, over the course of about 8 months. She actually completed 3 cycles of egg freezing because she wanted to try to bank as many eggs as possible in order to increase her chances of being able to have a child using egg freezing. So really the point of egg freezing is to try to address this difference between biologically when we're primed to have children and socially when we might want to do that. So Eliza's story was that she'd actually been in a very long-term committed relationship between the ages of 21 to 32 with a much older man. He was 28 years older than her. He actually had a daughter who was older than her. And, you know, they were never intending to have a family together. It was just not part of the deal. It was not part of that relationship. So she said that family was just not on the cards for me. I mean, I didn't even allow myself to go there to even really think about it because it was just not possible in that context. He didn't want to have any further children. But that relationship had ended about 1.5 years before I met her. And so her horizons had slightly opened. She'd actually lost an enormous amount of weight, and she felt that she was sort of a new person and she was able to slightly reinvent herself. So she says, this is quotes, "I got 14 eggs on the first cycle and 7 on the next one, which was quite a drop and a bit disappointing, and then 11 on the third. I've got 33 in the freezer, which is good. It's just a massive peace of mind for me, really, I think, being single and wanting to have that opportunity to have a family, but not knowing when that's going to be because I feel like I'm maybe a bit picky when it comes to finding the right partner. And I don't want to rush into anything, but I don't want to deny myself the opportunity when I'm older. And also knowing that there's a bit of a history of early menopause in my family, it's in the background, and that's been a stressful thing churning around in my brain. I just wanted to have a little bit of an insurance policy. I know there are no guarantees, but I feel like I've done everything that I could possibly do now to try in the future if the opportunity came up. I still feel the pressure to be in a relationship. I get quite lonely, I guess, and I'd like to meet somebody from that perspective. But in terms of having a family, my feeling now is I'm more relaxed. I'd say I feel like I've done everything I can. Obviously, I'd like to meet someone, but I've never wanted to rush into anything. And I think if it didn't happen for me, because there are no guarantees, I don't know what's going to happen, I'd be very sad. But I would feel like I'd literally done everything I could do to try and prepare for the worst case scenario. If I went through IVF and it didn't work, I'd obviously be pretty upset, but I think I can't do any more than that at the moment. I feel it's taken a bit of a weight off my mind, I think, knowing that I've done it and that they're in the bank. Obviously, I want to try naturally and see what happens, but I've no idea what age I'm going to be when I meet someone. I think it's definitely taken a bit of weight off my mind to know that I've done this, and there's really nothing more I can do, to be honest. So Eliza's story is actually really typical of a lot of women I speak with. And you can see the amount of responsibility she has for trying to do her life in the right way. She doesn't want to just panic partner with anyone. She doesn't want to rush into anything. And she really doesn't want to leave herself in a situation where she might regret things in the future. So in sociology, we talk about this as, you know, there's the concept of anticipated regret. So she wants to do everything within her power now so that she doesn't end up saying what if down the line things don't work out for her. So she says, I know it might not happen, who knows? But knowing that I've done everything I can is really helpful for me. So Eliza actually found her experience with egg freezing really helpful. She described it as empowering. She describes it as giving her peace of mind and giving her more options. Mia had a slightly different experience. She was 37 when she came to the clinic. Very successful, professional, independent woman living in London, very active, incredibly fit. She had no reason to assume that she would have any fertility issues. she expected that everything would go really well. And really that was the indications in the work up to her egg freezing. Everything did seem to be going well. And then on the day of her egg collection, things didn't go as well as she had anticipated. She actually ended up getting only 5 eggs, which was much lower than the number she'd been led to anticipate, and actually suffered quite a lot after the egg collection. She felt very sick, she felt very bloated. She actually had to do a couple of trips to the hospital. So she said that since her egg freezing, she'd been feeling really sad and anxious, both about the results of her egg freezing cycle and what she felt these might say about her underlying fertility. So before freezing her eggs, she just assumed that everything was fine, that she was very fertile, and she was just doing this as a precaution. Having got only 5 eggs, she was not only disappointed at having spent all that money, but she was also thinking, well, why have I only got 5 eggs when they said I'd probably get 12 or 14? You know, actually, am I not as healthy as I thought I was? And she was thinking about going for another round, but also feeling really resentful of the cost of that, and also feeling quite stressed about knowingly putting herself through something that had ended up with her feeling very sick the last time. And at the end of our interview, she said she was in a state of anxiety about her present circumstances and future fertility, but also that she sort of really hoped that everything might turn out okay. And what I found really touching was right at the end of the interview, sort of when she was about to walk out, she said, oh, do you mind sending me a copy of the transcript of our interview? Because, you know, I'm in a very particular headspace right now, and maybe in 5 years' time, I'll look back on all of this and it will have all worked out fine, and I'll just say, why was I being such a wimp about it? And I can look back and, you know, see this as kind of like a little blip. And I very much hope that that's the case for her. But it's also, I think, important to be aware of this flip side. And then I'm just going to read you one more case study before we have a break. And this is a woman called Carrie. And Carrie was very interesting. She was in my single women's study, although when she first came to the fertility clinic, age 37, she was in a relationship. But her partner wasn't very supportive and he wasn't very interested, so she actually registered as a single woman with the clinic, and that's why she received all the information about my study and said, actually, I want to come and talk to you as well. So I was like, okay. And this is how she describes her relationship. She'd been with her partner for 3 years, and they'd always spoken about having children together one day in the future. She says, anyway, as the sort of years passed, up until about last year, which is when I would have been sort of 36, turning 37, and I kind of felt, okay, it's been a couple of years, I want to sort of know that this is something we could do together. And he was very resistant, said he wasn't ready yet. And I sort of started to get a sense that maybe he wouldn't be ready for quite a long time. Well, certainly not when I was ready, so I kind of found myself in a bit of a tricky situation, where I felt like my fertility and chances of having a child were completely bound up with the success of that relationship. For some reason in my mind, I couldn't separate them, and I couldn't see that I had any other options. And it was all about, gosh, you're going to be 38 in November, you've been with this man for nearly 3 years, what do you do? Do you leave him, and then what am I going to do? How am I going to find someone else? Then spend enough time with them to, then I might be in my 40s. And so I was just, in quite a stuck mindset. I felt trapped. So I kind of kept sort of hammering away at the relationship, hoping something would change. And then it really didn't feel like it would. So she decided to come to the fertility clinic, initially just to get a fertility MOT, because her partner was saying, look, I'm not ready, we've got time, don't panic, you're being unreasonable. And she was like, well, I'm actually really anxious, so I want to go and see a doctor and find out, do I have time, like he says, or do I actually really need to hurry up with this? And she had a fertility MOT, and happily for her, actually, her fertility was very good for her age. And the doctor said to her, actually, you're in a really good position. You could easily conceive if you went through treatment now. And that slightly planted a seed in her head. And she says, I had surprisingly good results, AMH, whatever it is. And the doctor, was quite positive about the situation. And I just came away thinking, okay, this is quite helpful. He told me all the options. And I just suddenly started to see a massive world of opportunity in front of me I hadn't been able to see before. So she's talking about the opportunity to pursue solo motherhood using donor sperm. it was just, I couldn't stop talking about it. It was so liberating, so empowering. And I just sort of knew, okay, I'm going to do something with or without him, with or without you. So at this point, I was thinking about egg freezing. I was still with my partner, and at that point in my head, I was thinking, okay, maybe I'll freeze my eggs and wait for him to be ready, and that's where I was at. And then I say to her, okay, so what made you change your mind to pursue solo motherhood? She says, I talked to a guy at work who's in a relationship with his partner, a same-sex relationship, and they were having twins with a lesbian couple. And I just had this really interesting conversation. And he said, you know, why are you freezing your eggs? What are you waiting for? And I was like, anyway, I needed someone to tell me what's going on. And I was like, yeah, what am I waiting for? I'm waiting for somebody else. I'm waiting for him to be ready. And this guy was like, well, how long is he going to be? And I was like, I don't know. And then I said, well, you know, but if the eggs are 37, even if he takes like 4 years, my body's going to be 41. It's still okay. And he said, yeah, but do you want to wait until you're 41? Never mind about your eggs. Do you want to wait that long? And I was like, no. And he was like, well, when do you want to do it? And I was like, I want to do it now. Like, I'm ready. And he was like, well, yeah, maybe you need to think about that. And I was like, yes. So then having sort of gone through this process, Carrie decides actually she can't wait for this relationship, which she kind of felt wasn't really working, to try and work or to try and change. And she felt that what was really important for her at this moment in time was to really try to become a mother. So she broke off the relationship, and she says, just as soon as I'd done it, just as soon as I'd broken up with him, I kind of expected to feel really devastated. And I didn't. I felt kind of really empowered and excited. And I felt like what I'd actually done, rather than remove my one option of having a child, which is what I'd previously thought, I'd removed a person who was holding me back from wanting to have a child, my one obstacle. And it was crazy. All this time, I'd conceptualized him as the key I needed to get to this next stage. And then I realized he was actually the obstacle, the one obstacle that was blocking my progress. So I'll leave it there. And we can have a little break, and I would love your thoughts and feedback on these case studies. And I have more case studies if you'd like to hear any more after the break as well. Thank you.